Well, very quickly now begin. I'd like to thank Dinesh and of course the entire team of the Delhi Photo Festival for the invitation to speak here, and of course for organizing the festival over the last several years, the second issue which we are attending. Um, it was a very generous introduction to say that I know a lot about photography in India, but it's really an area that I think of as a micro history associated with, a history that we have going back 160, 170 years. It's also, I must say, a history that is largely untouched in terms of research, in terms of scholarship, a kind of pedagogical watershed, I would say, is what we have. So it's very difficult coming from the background that I do, which is really art historical, to understand modernity or post-modernity without actually understanding the tradition of Indian photography, or rather, let us say, photography in India. What I'm trying to look at today is South Asia, but this is not a kind of iteration of the best photographers or the most well-known photographers or the leading photographers. Rather, it is an exercise in understanding what South Asia means within the context of an archive. So I work as a curator to an archive that has over 90,000 images, and all of these images are kind of ebbing and flowing within the context of the geography of what we consider South Asia to be today. It's certainly about itinerant photographers traveling from time to time and from place to place. So the point here is that I would be addressing the complexities of understanding geography and identity, and it's really based on a publication that is due to come out in the next 2 weeks, of an exhibition that we are doing in New York at the Rubin Museum. It is a museum dedicated to Indian art, well, South Asian art or Asian art, but with a big focus on India. And the title of that exhibition is Allegory and Illusion, something that I will try to explain within the course or in the course of this lecture. So I begin here. With photography, we privilege a medium to which there are many variables, assertions, and alliances. Some of the complications that will occur here emerge when I highlight what I consider to be photography in South Asia or photography from South Asia. Should we privilege the photographer or the medium? Is it South Asian photographers that concern us? Or is it the South Asian region per se? Photographs of people in South Asia, or the history of photography in the region as a whole? All of these positions designated convergences when we thought of doing this exhibition, and we're doing it as in I am doing it with a co-curator, Beth Citron, in New York, as I mentioned, opening at the Rubin Museum. Does the archive hold any way of approaching or deviating from a collective identity in South Asia? But the archive certainly presents these areas as ones of constant revision, redrafted with time, certainly redrafted with geography. What India was in the 19th century is certainly not what India is today. So how do we actually understand South Asian photography within the context of an archive? It's very different. My stance then looks at material primarily from a collection, which is the Al-Qazi collection, not all collections as such, and hence this is a work in progress awaiting a larger surfeit of material that will emerge from the archive, and I'm talking about the archive that will exist in and outside India. This is also about the portrait, the body, perhaps even the figuration as the abstract form of the real body. And so if I begin here with a daguerreotype was the first photographic process that was patented and it is the photograph of a victim, it is the photograph of a victor, of a face that may have struck the viewer as a complex overlaying of chemicals upon metal. This is the portrait of Henry Havelock, who died in the Tira expedition by a Khaibari tribesman in the 1850s. And at times, death in an image was also trying to arrest the moment of the exiting of life. And this became quite an important, I would say, trope within European photography, where the dead person was uplifted and his eyes were prized open so that he could look directly into the camera, and you could notice that flicker of life that had just suddenly left him. It takes on a kind of macabre stance, and I particularly enjoy showing you this image of two severed heads in a kind of embrace, or let us say in a kiss. I often think of this as my relationship to the archive very often, contending with all this historic material, but also falling in love with it and disliking it from time to time. This is, of course, by a French neurologist called Duchenne, and he wrote a book called The Mechanism of Facial Expressions by attaching electrodes to faces, and therefore coming up with the notion of how actually facial expressions are made. So if you're on your email and you have these emoticons, it is really inspired by the work that he did 170 years ago. Looking at the daguerreotype, I decided to take a quote of an artist from the 19th century. And he said, "We didn't trust ourselves at first to look long at human beings and believed that the little tiny faces in the picture could see us. So powerfully was everyone affected by the unaccustomed clarity and the unaccustomed truth." The German artist Karl Blossfeld was disturbed upon seeing his own species imprinted on a shimmering sheet in an unconventional manner. Unconventional because the subject had perished and had left an imprint. The power of a portrait lies in the uneasy acceptance that while you reflect upon this subject, somehow those eyes, the tiny impressions of light upon paper, they look back at you. So photography has repeatedly genuflected to the portrait, a means of staging the self, and at times this is done with the defiant pose, images here from Sri Lanka by a company called Skeen, or at times with the distant gaze, with Burmese images that are flowing through in the 19th century, all with photographers who are tying India or South Asia into a kind of visual thesaurus. But when we think of the portrait, we think of the innate connection with the integrity of the body, rather our elusive connection only with the face. But what occurs when one dismembers a portion of it, severs it within an annotative complex of a mounted board, such as this image? The execution of Shamitsu Seiji in 1864, the revolutionary responsible for the double murders of Lieutenant Byrd and Colonel Baldwin of the British Army in Japan, shows a simultaneous narrative of draftsmanship and photography. The head of the samurai leader is accompanied by a space where the two army men were killed, the spot at which their bodies were found in the center, as well as a sketch of the moment of the rebels' beheading. The gentle composure of the severed head, almost like a sculpted profile, was proof then of how life had exited this body, and the image was circulated to the Bokofu, the government militia responsible for the death of the samurai. And this is where the notion of the portrait for me suffered a little. The depiction confused me a little, and the claim to the subject deflected a little, a claim seen here within a composition of three trajectories: the moment of execution, the site of violence, and the image of retribution. They are all then the portrait of an event. The image is a similar and different, let us say, example of what we would call post-mortem images in India. death is the final act of self-expression that is not in control of the subject, and the photographer as a cosmetologist in which the skilled adornment of the dead, the subject is now made more emphatic in a nowhere kind of space. The portrait then has a metaphorical connection with time and an analytical connection with space, which can itself be a dying of sorts. And here I always think of the work of Protiks from Bangladesh, because there's a kind of ephemeral, overexposed quality to it. And I think he calls this work What Remains, something like Sally Mann's work, which was of course very different and very macabre, but it reminded me of the fleeting quality of what an image is meant to capture in a portrait. The phenomenal effect of media, the staging of the other as a corpse, as a cadaver, later as an effigy, these are some of the aspects of the 19th century that highlight the inanimate photograph with the stilled transience of the body, its lack of a remaining context. Is it only in life that geography manifests itself as identity? The image then demands a doubling in which narration is often doubled through an enframing of the story within another story. And I like taking the example of this. Some of you who were there for the workshop yesterday will notice the Bhawal Sannyasi case, another example from current-day Bangladesh, where a ruler exits, as it were, his city, but returns as an ascetic many years later. And the photographs are really meant for a law suit that is filed in which we're trying to assert the identity, or at least the sadhu is asserting the identity of being this ruler. And of course, images play an essential role in the legal sort of decrees that are passed in the future, and it is known as one of the longest cases for the proving of an identity in Indian law practice. The two lives shared by an image, the seeing and the showing, or the many lives shared in the afterlife of an image, is what happens when you juxtapose it with the contemporary. I often think and now ask, is there ever a distinct moment, therefore, for South Asian photography? Or does the archive shock us with its interrelatability? Does the contemporary mass of images overtake a historical one by sheer numbers? Or is the archive a signboard for future images? In a popular and controversial contemporary exhibition titled Beneath the Skin, the people of various erstwhile colonies have voiced their deep concern about the evolution of thought around the treatment of human remains. In this landmark exposition, which was in Germany, Physical Identity and Genetic Line, there appears to be a rupture between public sentiment and institutional concerns. The curators are now re-evaluating how cultural organizations should handle these bodies in order to preserve the dignity of the dead. Furthermore, many museums now sense mounting pressure about how former colonies should repatriate ancestral remains so as to give generations of families a sense of peace by laying these objects to rest. This would lead to another kind of a complex. How do we conceptualize identity in space and time regionally or historically? If we were to claim India, in at least India, that Kumaraswamy noted, traditional conceptions of the human likeness, he is then trying to dismantle culturally conditioned characterizations of portraiture as posthumous, hieratic, ideal images that are then formed into the everyday life images, the profane, the sentimental, and are these to be viewed as effective stances to be taken? I have always felt that a kind of hierarchy that emerged in art practice creates a kind of anarchy in photography. The formal qualities of photography discontinue in our present as high and low. Yet the archive, in its moment of occurrence, must always speak of context in order to understand importance. So cultural estrangement, I would say, an imperial kind of hubris or pride, these were aspects that were writ large in the ideologies, institutional and visual practices of the 19th century. And as Suren Lalwani, who's a well-known scholar in the field, she said this comes through particularly with the aspect of bodies, with the aspect of portraiture. The imaging of a likeness becomes a means of negotiating interpersonal engagement, those who were classified within images and the patrons for whom they were made. The reaction of a public in the aftermath of the colonial era cited in the Bodies exhibition, for instance, in Berlin, is an indicator that objects were constantly changing hands and recasting themselves with identity into new hands, into new lands. But here there is now a renewed drive to return what was once misplaced. And so the role then of early photography from the subcontinent in its own history of art is essential when considering the abstract idea of presence in portrait and in photography. And this is where for me the allegorical reference came in, or the illusional reference came in. S.B. Said's image that you see encouraged its viewers to contemplate, as Crispini says, Usha or Chitralekha in an old narrative based on a sketch or a painting, let us say, of Ravi Verma and a Telugu play that was performed in 1901. I'm referencing the 19th century or early 20th century image on the top left-hand side corner and how it might be related to the top right-hand side corner. Usha, the daughter of a king, dreamt one night that she had been kissed by a handsome prince. She then asked the artist Chitralekha to produce portraits of local princes through which Usha was made to identify her future husband. And he turns out to, of course, be Anirudh, who's the grandson of Krishna. But in Ravi Verma's image, we see Chitralekha seated on the floor, producing images which Usha then contemplates. So photography is then realized as a form of cultural production that lays claim to the past, and this is mediated by the act of display. So that is to say that the Usha image on the right would then relate with an image that you see on the bottom right corner, which is of two Jaipur photographers, Govindram and Udayram, from the 19th century, which then relates to lithographic images on the backs of carte de visites or cabinet card images, showing the artist at work, the portrait of an artist with a palette and an easel and a canvas and paint, which then in some kind of elusive manner relates to Amrita Shergill's portrait, wherein she is also looking back at the viewer. So with the subject of the body or the figure at the heart of the exhibition, we realize that the portraits not only exemplify this kind of historical or contextual understanding of people and community within conventional tropes. The latter, and I mean the contemporary when it comes into play, often pays homage to this archive as a source of retrieval. And it is here that some of the most searching questions about the origination of photographic types, their social effects, and the broader field of approaches through the practice of what I will call point-blank photography comes to bear. For me, these archival images connect with the contemporary by questioning how the making of a portrait changed and how it went in changing us, its public. What were the constitutive factors at play, and simultaneously whether the images from the past and the present liaise purely on the basis of stylistic means. So the actual migration of works, you could say, across geographical space and then extended to discursive space is indicated as a metaphor adapted for objects produced at one time, then juxtaposed with those produced at another time through a visual as well as conceptual networking. The idea of temporal and compositional distance and nearness seen in and through images is deployed as a comment on the archive, and in an effort to gauge how objects become repositories of meaning, how they become repositories often of power. A vintage collection that is amassed privately is juxtaposed with a kind of contemporary archive being developed that is amassed publicly, and this might be through social media networks. It's certainly something we are trying with platforms such as Pix. The fundamental difference in collecting practices is significant as we encounter the debris of photographic excesses from opposite ends of the scale, but plausibly with similar intent to showcase representative works over broad spans of time. And here we have the work, I've just juxtaposed them, of Dominic Sansoni and his understanding of identity issues in culturally integrated parts of Colombo in the aftermath of the Civil War, like we see on the right-hand side. In each case, relative distance and nearness allows the photographer to shuffle objectivity and a contextual reading, a kind of different register of homoeroticism that you see in both images. Sansoni's own private collection includes the pictorial work of German settler from the 1930s, Lionel Wendt, which casts an eye, let us say, on his conditioning in another way. Wendt's homoerotic images, as the one you see on the left-hand side, are severely posed and represent a kind of Orientalism in which the female figure has been replaced by the male one, a reversal of gendered norms in time that is being produced gradually. Wendt's playfulness with form is almost akin to the devotional recognition of his subject as his subjects are appreciated for their beauty. Interestingly, these works can also be compared with French photographer Alain Dallalieu and the Swiss companion Raymond Bernier, who were traveling through India in the 1930s, and a lot of their work, which was shooting architectural sites and sculptures, got reproduced in Stella Kramrisch's books. Stella Kramrisch's books really representative of the scholarship on Indian architecture from the 80s, 70s, 80s, and onwards. On the other hand, in comparing these two images, am I also addressing the complexities about how the nature of changing acquisition practices can reframe the importance of what we consider legitimate works? This, in a similar sense, indicates historically judged images, newly acquired works that are often termed in this high and low manner. In a photograph of the Vedas that you see over here by Plate and Company, established in the 1890s in Kandy, the photographer and his wife, who's called Clara, maintain relative distance between themselves and the Aboriginal hunting tribe, poised with stretched bows aimed at imaginary prey. The area between the marksman and his subject is the range of space known as point blank and relates to a kind of visual directness, a concentrated focus. And this term is what I'd like to use after looking at material that came out from the northwest frontier from Afghanistan. And this is the work of a man called William Burke, who was a Catholic working in the lower ranks of the British Army. But he documented excessively the Second Afghan War and the Great Game, as it was called, while the Russian imperial interests were stretching eastwards. In any case, it was about the notion of targeting, of looking, of shooting, that I would like to use the metaphor of the point blank, which also relates interestingly to the work of Q. Sakamaki, coming out of Sri Lanka during the years of the Civil War. Other photographers would also shoot, I'm returning to the image, would also shoot this tribe, but they were reproduced in the photographic news in Melbourne in 1881 and recognized for their bold photographic spirit, the atmosphere, the separation of distances, the technical treatment that mystically aligned to create an apt portrait. In realistic terms, the practicalities of early photographic processes required longer exposure times, and it was essentially the photographer's desire to take his subjects to a secluded area in order to properly compose them. A sense of inexperience, you could say, or awkwardness, therefore entered these unintentionally framed situations, and so the directness often appears to be exaggerated from time to time. Seen here with the Sri Lankan nobility, seen here with the hairy family of Burma, or seen, let us say, with the Nepalese royalty, the courtesans of the Nepalese Rana court. This tunnel vision towards the subject is no better illustrated than, I feel, in the consideration of portraits, but also of the group, the manner in which their surroundings have underwritten a kind of outward conditioning. Citing, for example, tea planters that you see here from Sri Lanka, or the grain sellers that you see depicted in these images, again of Udairam and Govindram from the 1880s, they are relying greatly on a school of painting called the Company School of Painting, generating a visual compendium of labor in history. Photography theorist Alan Sakula's response to these images are that they become a kind of manual. We are not only looking at the person depicted, but we are also looking at them in terms of their provenance. And so looking at a community and surmising their identity in terms of place or geography is also happening in earlier volumes, pictorial volumes that we looked at yesterday, such as Les Hindous by Balthazar Solvins, or let us say the Oriental Races and Tribes, which are photo montages. The notion of the straightforward occupation image, which has a long-standing tradition in the subcontinent, was made a little more complex with the differentiation of gendered formats. And of course, this work is pretty early. It's from 1863 by William Johnson and represents one of the early photo montage works where the person is placed in front of his idyllic, or let us say his most essential cultural backdrop. As opposed to the scientific stilled image that you see over here, there now emerged facets of planned spontaneity, transforming the notion of the steadied body in space, wherein the point-blank photographer became an orchestrator of a performance. He became the orchestrator of an enactment. Some of these images may also be derivative of more local references to Pahari paintings that we see emerging in Himachal Pradesh, and show influences from Mughal miniatures such as those of the recently acknowledged artists by B.N. Goswami and Eberhard Fischer, Nain Sukh, as patronized by Raja Balwant Singh of Jasrota. Pahari images often show sort of female courtesans and mistresses waiting longingly on dark monsoon evenings for their companions to arrive. Similarly, in more modern circumstances, the female courtesan became a trope, and the Nautch girl took on this persona, performing her daily private duties, as it were, in a miniature format presented, as you can see, by Udairam and Govindram, and it's been titled playfully, as it were, Playing Cards. And these composed images show distinct connections with a kind of traditional artistic lineage, providing a function to the female form as those of virtues, and help to shape how visual discourses of formal portraiture connected them with more public values. These are also studio backdrops, at least in this one, the backdrop that has been used, I have to say, is also been used by photographers such as Ram Singh II of Jaipur, who is known as one of the first photographer kings, and a bunch of his glass plates, I believe 1947, an easy number to remember, actually exists at the Jaipur City Palace and is being documented currently. And Ram Singh was, of course, known for documenting the bais of his court as well as the courtesans. However, in this confounding between the distracted courtesan and the dignified royal lady lies an interweaving of performing and being. Here, the photographer of the earlier series from Jaipur deploys a kind of narrative mode, but I thought I would stretch the limits of that and show you images coming out of Iran on the left-hand side, taken by a man called Antoine Sevrugen. He was actually born of an Algerian mother and father, but was born within the Russian embassy within Tehran. And he goes to shoot these incredible images, which one would call Orientalist images, which then very much connect with the kind of visual language being created by Indian photographers or photographers in India. On the other hand, we have glass negatives that are being shown in the exhibition, such as this one, portraying 4 women with their pallus, 2 of whom have draped it over their faces. Perhaps this was to project in a simultaneous manner both exposure and concealment within the same image. The function of these photos is therefore one of a desire, perhaps, to know what lies behind the veil, but also to maintain the veil within the realm of the photographer. And here the photographer becomes a kind of cultural practitioner, trying to communicate the essence of Indian values, projected through the stance and countenance of bodies. Though through his ways of framing and through their act of gesturing and lighting, would have communicated a kind of mood for the moment. This is also about trying to, let us say, bring a European community within the fold and accustom them to more domestic aspects of Indian values. I've also juxtaposed this with similar images arising again in Tehran in the 19th century at around the same time. We can then assume that there emerged a new kind of public which could appreciate these for their message, but also for their exchanges, representational practices emerging from the West, in which this sense of an idealized East was being created, wherein the point-blank range was tempered based on levels of knowledge, degrees of comfort, and the aesthetic requisites of composition. At a glance, looking at the work of Italian photographer in Burma, Felice Beato, or let us say Herzog and Higgins, one of the leading photographers to the Queen of England and of course the courts of India, and here we see Nepal on the right-hand side, or of course other photographers emerging in the early 20th century in Nepal, such as Richard Gordon Mazzini, some of whose work I think we might have even seen yesterday. All of these are trying to project this domestication of space and bringing people within the fold of a newly emerging modern view. The domestication of spaces in these images allows us for creating indulgences, personal whims to enter the pictorial frame, and occasioned, let us say, the popular family photograph to enter the midst of single-person images, and also broadened, let us say, the commercial scope of images. Apart from being a veritable genetic record or trace, the photograph became a personal object of appreciation and hence an object of fetish, you could say. The shifting appeal of the image was the inevitable pitfall of this nearness and distance, negotiated through planes of proximity, but also through mass usage and circulation. The austere composure of the tribesman in this image taken on the northwest frontier by Randolph Besant Holmes alleges the illusion of the eternal wanderer, the thinker, the distant pastoral dream. It draws on the studied poses of the English theatre and the renowned art studies taken by Shapur and Bhedwar, another album we saw in the original here, shot in the 1890s by Parsi photographer, looking at more pictorial aspects of photography. And I also mentioned that these were reproduced in New York in 1910 in camera work that was started by Alfred Stieglitz. The ability to mass produce led to a proliferation of a stock of images, bringing the enthralling world of printed images within reach, a domestication and a democratization of photography through organized capitalism, and the unprecedented expansion of print media through the production of chromolithographs and poster art a little later. After the invention of the Eastman Kodak in 1888, the amateur photographer merely had to return the camera to the company for developing the film, and Kodak would return the camera with the new film loaded. The rise of personal photography, therefore, and image-making practices led to a re-engagement with the studied poses of an earlier era. And so what I've also tried to show over here is that there's a representation of types of a kind of Orientalism that enters the picture plane, and a kind of genre studies that also allows us to appreciate the work of emerging photographers whose resonance in India can be found. This is the work of Roger Fenton, who was one of the first photographers of the Crimean War. But he is also, let us say, the muse of someone like Felice Beato, who is known as the first war photographer in India. And Roger Fenton, as it were, studies in the studios of Paul Delaroche and Henri Lasec in Paris. And these are studios which kind of practice or look at the image as a romantic image, an idealized world. And so one can then imagine how from Paris to the Crimea to India, kind of vision is circulating and and extending its sort of abilities and range of reference. This is also extended to subsequent work that was done with gypsies, let us say also in the area of Romania, also done by Roger Fenton. And this is the work that I'm showing you so that you know the kind of influences that photographers in India or South Asia were looking at, were being sort of compelled to ponder about before visualizing India here. The enclosed space of the studio became an environment of consent, and closeness or alienation that was experienced was really about the photographer's mapping of his subject. The Shan rulers of Burma, for instance, have been placed in front of this extraordinarily woven fabric, represented and represents a kind of courtly culture that emerged and flourished during the 19th century. The photographer has lent a sense of dignity and respect to the subject in accordance with their political status, though at times more space was required for, let us say, images of coercion rather than consent. The prisoners in Burma, let us say at around the same time of the Third Anglo-Burmese War, shot by Felice Beato, or those by Hooper of the famine in India, create more of a separation between the viewer and the subject. The reversal of norms lies in making a spectacle of them, primarily that of a spectacle of suffering. The prisoners, as you saw earlier, are kind of doomed to writhe in the scorching sun, to burn with the light that shines upon them. And you can see this, perhaps, if you zoom in to their parched lips. The famine-stricken grieve in their perennial state of abandonment, images of continuing penance or an unending suffering and the hopelessness that comes with the domain of art as reportage. In 1894, the proliferation of portraits, sometimes even those of suffering and dying, became extremely, let us say, ubiquitous through the format of picture postcards. But this sense, as you see over here, the sense of smallness facilitated easy circulation and was another means of globalizing the image, bringing its affairs closer together and familiarizing people from distant spaces with imagery coming out of South Asia. However, the archive of images from the colonial period precludes another kind of miniaturization, wherein a corpus so vast and so politically rife can in fact only be assimilated through a kind of miniaturization. In the final analysis, mechanical reproduction is a technique of diminution that helps us to achieve a sense of the archive. But this is not the only sense of an archive that should be left with us. And I take a quote here of now a contemporary photographer whose exhibition we did, called the Calcutta Diaries. And he says, "We all make our own language as we go along, and the archive is a reservoir of this language, and it needs to undergo a constant process of re-engagement. They are the guardians of our memories." Also says Pablo Bartholomew, who also believes that time is a great filter in terms of creating objectivity, letting one gauge, let us say, freshness or newness can only be pieced together when we look at an archive and how it constitutes the past. This is an image of the Chinese residents of Calcutta shot in the 70s. And invoking this idea as a working practice, over the last decades, photographers in South Asia have begun to actively liaise with the past in unanticipated ways, which for the art historian conveys an essence or sense of continuity. This may be articulated through the Freudian notion, perhaps, that photography empowers our faculty of recollection in abstract ways and occasionally empowers the act of memory making. In a similar vein, one is trying to look at aspects of connectivity between the vintage and the contemporary in a conscious way in order to articulate the possibility of stylistic development and forms of creative departure. In doing so, one will scout for images that are citation images or history images, but these are also points of initiation, points of retrieval, And these can be sort of recognized by another sense that I bring to an image, which is called the sense of an intervisuality, taken from the term used by Nicholas Mirzoff. And this may lead to a kind of constitutive pattern of imaging practices where you have a visual construction of the social. I always like looking at this image of the French photographer Olivier Cullmann called The Others, and his representation of types through montages within a make-believe photography studio. His self-portraits, primarily those relating to the studio portraits, are ones of types. This aspect is also exemplified, let us say, by Pakistani photographer Nariman Ansari in her series called Transcending Stereotypes, in which the image is accompanied by a descriptive caption about the kind of persona who is being imprisoned within the image. The approach, however, is frontal, and what excites the prospect of a comparison is the idea of the photographic effect. This is not the effect of the over-dramatized tableau, but the effect of the deadpan. The lack of drama, the lack of hyperbole, the creation of neutral spaces, or indeed empty ones, that augments the sense of exclusion. Much like the historical photograph, at times the deadpan presupposes that events can be engineered and that the point-blank range highlights a sense of certainty, almost over certainty. The intention here is then also to address the aura of an image. This often has an evolving relationship with its surroundings, and let us say it gives a bipolar notion also of space, a space that can be anywhere and a face that can be read as a metonym of a condition and that of a deadpan condition perhaps. And so between this obsessive memory of tradition that I have, which one knows only by what is being said, there is also a kind of exaggerated thoughtlessness of oblivion that lies within the interim period of the archive and the contemporary. And what is being said is only being said within, let us say, a subjective point of view. I've also used tropes over here that are significant within a literary sense, because 19th century photography is illustrative, is very prescriptive at many times, but it is not only being conditioned by the writing that accompanies an image. We have to take into account ideas of the metaphor, of the metonymy, of slippages in language, ones that open up dimensions of meaning, and let us say, as Roland Barthes imagines, to create an obtruse image rather than an obvious image. To question what temporal area images occupy and what exactly is their bearing in relation to the past, this is something that is a preponderating question within a sense of the archive. The answer, however, rests somewhere between, let us say, amnesia and the imagination, that which is drawn from creative emulation and the re-examination of the expectations of an image's meaning. This is an image taken by Iranian contemporary photographer Niku Tarkhani, where she finds family photographs in her archive, but she superimposes her own face on these postcard-like images in order to create a kind of genetic line for the portrait. And I would also embrace the notion over here that images, therefore, from the archive and from the contemporary, resonate with a sense of a dubious fiction. And so let us say, reintroducing the exhibition Beneath the Skin about returning bodies to their points of origin, an investigation of the archive is also attuned to this returning of the body, of the photograph, in this case to the domain of its origins perhaps, and is also about a trope about understanding how the contemporary works. Where does the object of the contemporary photograph actually reside? Where is its home? We know that the photograph has allegiances with its provenance, but it cannot merely be defined by provenance. This sense of a changing temporality of an image is significant because it outlives the terms of its maker. This is true both of entities, the vintage and the contemporary, in which objects, or in this case the body, or let us say in a subtle sense the photograph, outlives the terms of the photographer. Thank you.
Hi, Rahab. I'm Amit Madesha, and thank you so much for a very insightful lecture. What I'm interested in is the geography that you were treading in your lecture. It's quite a vast canvas that you're trying to look at, and in the earlier part of your lecture, you were trying to bring images, trying to juxtapose images from, let's say, from India and to Afghanistan and from Iran.
Yes.
So that's a very interesting juxtaposition that I saw, and then you later on mentioned about Roger Fenton and Felice Beato, and that is what something I'm very much interested in. It completely blew my mind. I didn't know that kind of exchange happened. So is there any written documentation, any records of that, the exchange between the two? Because Roger Fenton was, of course, he was a very influential photographer. He must have influenced. But in the sense, is there any correspondence between them? What happened, and how much was Roger Fenton a real influence on Felice Beato and the kind of work that he did in India?
Certainly, there is a lot of documentation, and there's a publication called Of Battle and Beauty about sort of tracing the life of Beato. There are any number of books, of course, on Roger Fenton, but a great resource is actually one residing within Windsor Castle. Windsor Castle has one of the largest collections of Felice Beato and Roger Fenton, and one of our ex-curators, we had a small office in London, which we've now shut, but one of our ex-curators is now the curator of the Windsor collection in London. And if you do have any queries, all the correspondences, most of the correspondences reside there, but they are reproduced in this publication Of Battle and Beauty, and which is where I've referenced them from. There are any number of references that can be found within archives in India. I mean, we have a sizable amount of Beatos in our collection, as it were, which is actually your collection. It's really meant for the public. And there are written documents that have been reproduced in the 19th century themselves. So we have a publication, for instance, which was taken out during, just after the mutiny, which looks at the written accounts of a man called William Howard Russell, who's going around with Felice Beato and going around with a Swedish artist called Egron Lundgren, and all of them are collaborating and talking about their influences and so on. So certainly there are, and if you give me your email after, I will give you a barrage of books to read. I'll be happy to do so.
Thanks, sir.
One of the, just as a comment, one of the problems that I've really had in looking at the archive and sort of contending with material is the lack of an interconnected history of South Asia, which I think exists within archives. The leap into the contemporary is really a conceptual one being made currently. It's just a recent foray that I've started making, and it's really open to questioning and suggestions because it is a bit of a leap. And I think one has to believe in the fact, at least I do, that things have, that history kind of repeats itself over patterns of time, and this leads to different engagements in the essential understanding of the power of an image. So even while working on contemporary scenarios with the team that we have in PIX, we often realize that a writer or a curator or a photographer or an academic or someone from the corporate world, they all understand the power of images in very, very different ways. And I think each one is a very essential contributor to a kind of practice, visual practice of understanding what images do to us, the powers that they actually exercise over us. And sometimes images certainly become the only testimony that you have to interpreting events. And this is where photojournalism, I think, is really extraordinary and breaks barriers. I mean, one of the recent images you had with the tragic event of the building falling in Dhaka, and that image of the two people in an impassioned embrace, I mean, they really communicate across borders. So it's with that, let us say, notation that this paper and this exercise of allegory and illusion is sort of come about.
Well, it's a question which I've always wondered is that for an archive, is it important to have work which is to do with the history of the time or the creative input of the photograph? Because I think there probably also could be a clash between the two. It's creative could be an interpretation of the photographer, whereas...
Certainly. Yeah, no, that's a great question, because it's possibly a very difficult one to answer. The thing about archives is that they are collected by certain people, or they're collected by certain institutions, and I think one should question the archive for this purpose. It's about the collecting practice of the Al-Ghazi collection is about the collecting practice of one man. The IGNC is about the collecting practice of an institution. And so you have different ways in which people have...
If I may just add to what I was going to say, is that, so therefore, would you see a difference between an archive and a gallery? And how would that be so?
No, not really. What I'm trying to, I'm sort of taking a step back from your question, really, is to say that before one understands what is representative within the archive, one has to also look at how it's been collected and the reasons for which it's been collected. So bearing that in mind, one can certainly look at conventional tropes that have defined how an image can be appreciated within the 19th century. There's a huge lineage with painting, for instance, at that time. It's very difficult to define or answer that question within contemporary practice unless you have a relative experience. So for me, that image within the archive becomes that much more important if it can connect with something within the contemporary and resonate with a sort of, temporal power of that kind. It's not always the case that you find it, and I'm talking about it from the point of view of an art historian after having studied 19th century painting. But certainly that might not stand for a photographer. A photographer might find a different kind of resonance within the 19th century archive altogether. So I think that's a shifting balance, and the more one gets to look into archives, the more archives that are volunteered before, a public, leads to a sort of greater understanding of what has passed. And the terms legitimate or not legitimate, or high and low, or good or bad, these are so relative within the scope of the archive that sometimes it's just a sheer sense of historical understanding that highlights an image and gives it its importance. Sometimes it's, of course, the photographer. The image that you see over there of the Burmese lady is taken by Scowen and Skene, sort of prominent photographers in the 19th century. But when they came out, they were really sort of barred from a kind of exposure because they were thought to be somewhat perverse. So you can have 2 or 3 different readings of images, certainly. And I'm always interested, as we had the workshop yesterday, is to look at how young contemporary practitioners will piece together an archive or take apart an archive. So I think one of the future projects that one should engage in with the passage of time is to actually get photographers into the archive and for photographers to curate a show from the collection. That will lead to another frontier of understanding what is an important image or what is an essential image. And I think the bounds for that are just about emerging. So if any of you want to come together and do this exercise, we would really, really appreciate that kind of interaction.
You work primarily with the archive, but with PICS you're also curating contemporary photography. And while this might be the subject of an entire lecture, how do you think the portrait in South Asia has evolved?
Well, that's another mesmerizingly difficult question to answer. Within the context of the paper that I was trying to read, I think portraiture is really about levels of, as I was saying, distance and nearness. You can find relative composures based on this essential quality alone. I'm also interested in ideas of mapping. If you look at some of the exhibitions, let us say, that are trying to do a contextual reading, let us say the Shapurjat one that Philippe has done, the work that you have done yourself, I would actually say that the 19th century archive provides many resonances of this trope of locating people and recasting identity vis-a-vis space. But they also do that in a more playful manner with the work, as you see, of William Johnson that I was showing earlier, in a photo collage montage kind of way in the 19th century. And I think essentially finding a conditioning space for your portrait is always something that is driving photographers a little crazy. How do you actually take the portrait Do you blank out space? Do you actually do it in a context? Do you actually do it as a group? And I think all these resonances have a kind of equal importance. But if you want to trace a lineage to a 19th century practice, they all certainly exist. In fact, they exist in a kind of surfeit that is difficult to inscribe. I mean, most of the material that exists in these archives are portrait studies. But there are also studies in science. There are also studies engaging the size of the cranium, the height of the person, the scale of the individual. And I think that scale is also for us a cultural scale now. It's represented, departures from a 19th century practice. So what I've tried to do is, through a paper, is try to understand similar resonances that photographers have deployed with similar or different intentions. But certainly there's a visual a trajectory or an indexicality that allows us to trace this through image practices as well as textual practices. So just to answer your question, there's no definite trace, but there are many, many strains at work all at once.
Yeah. Hi. I just want to ask that while you were talking about the portraits of those men whose head was lying, and you mentioned that the suffering of portrait started. So I'd like to know that on what ground did you feel that the suffering started from that period of time?
I'm trying to understand your question a little more clearly, but what my intention was to say is that what you don't find a preponderance of now for all the right reasons and for possibly political reasons is it's very difficult to find. You will not go and into the market and find a portrait of famine-stricken people from any part of India or decapitated individuals. In the 19th century, that kind of imagery was so preponderant, and it was sort of almost a definitive gaze upon South Asia in many, many respects that look at the suffering of the people only to understand that the suffering was created by the gaze that was looking right at it. And this is where the archive takes on a kind of dubious fiction, because in trying to contend with the situation, the photographer inadvertently reveals himself or herself. It's an exposure they didn't really think would happen, but with the passage of time, it has. So my reading into the suffering was really about the mass circulation of that suffering through popular media or print media like the postcard. That was essentially it.
I feel like, for instance, photographs which are part of archives, in a way are like a window to a past age. You look back at 70, 80, 100 years. But part of the beauty of looking back is the physicality of that print and the degradation of age, which in effect actually in reverse is the beauty of that print. What do you think is going to happen with digital, where basically these are bytes sitting in people's computers and hard drives, possibly not aging physically in the same way as prints did? What do you think of that?
Well, I always think that one should print out images, and now you have fascinating bodies like, the Alt Lab in Goa that are actually producing daguerreotypes and albumin prints, and I would see that would be a worthwhile exercise in trying to reproduce your image with different printing practices as they exist, because for me, still looking at the print becomes an essential mode of understanding the materiality of it. But certainly that is not the only essential point being drawn right now. If you do have a digital print, I would think printing it on the papers that are coming out today is essential, because that will be a testimony of a time, because papers will change within the next 10 years or 15 years. So that substance has actually still got a certain amount of importance even today.
I was going to just add, because that's, to my mind, is almost like imposing a past practice on something which has actually changed.
Right.
The fact seems to be that photography has changed from being something to be seen on paper to be something to be seen on screen.
Right.
And then should therefore an archive be imposing something which happened earlier?
Certainly not.
Into the future?
Never. But I think you're also asking a particular individual from one archive that question.
No, of course, I'm asking.
But I
because there's something which engages
mm,
me as a photographer. It's just all that stuff which is sitting in my computer now.
Right.
I mean, I know that there are photographs which I have in boxes lying in some cupboards.
Right. Well, let me put it this way. In the 19th century, certainly the lives of images had not outrun the lives of human beings. Right now, there are more images circulating in the world than there are human beings. You're also talking about a certain surfeit in which, the digital mode is an essential mode of functioning, where the, 1 million or some estimate such as that of images being produced daily needs to be stored in a, let us say, an essential kind of way for the future. And I think social media practices are eventually going to become the art practices of the future in any case. However, if there does exist an archive that looks at paper and at materiality, you also understand that the temporal quality in which these things are printed, even digitally, has a lifespan. Your digital archival print is going to last 100, 150 years, whatever it might be, whatever the printers tell you to sell that paper. But they also become a testimony of a time because those medias will change. So it would be nice to know which photographers, looking, if you go into the 22nd century, to know which photographers in the 21st century wanted to use, given the vast availability of images, wanted to use that particular paper for that particular image, will be an essential part of how people will read into your images 100 years from now. That is what I feel is sort of the exchange we have with the archive sitting in its future to understand what the future of today might be with printing.
Some of the images that you had shown, especially the point blank image that you're speaking about, I think there's it's also a part of a large narrative of the ethnographic and anthropological study. So I'm just interested in knowing that how important is contemporary annotations in your in the work that you do as a curator in your showcase?
Well, it's certainly a point of I mentioned that the archive is a point of initiation, it's a point of return, it's a point of departure, it's a point of creative departure, it's a point of emulation, and it's a repetitive little cycle that occurs with the passage of time. I mean, history does kind of find its distinct links with the contemporary. So the contemporary is an essential point of reference. I mean, you cannot ignore the fact that you are living in a time and a space, and that will certainly condition how you're looking into history. But I think that is a productive problematic. There are some problematics which are troubling, but this is a problematic that we're stuck with, and it's very productive if you actually give an archive its own space, not only within the context that it's been brought up in, but within the contemporary. Just like we imagine why we're producing these images will have resonance several years from now, or in fact ways in which how we compile images at festivals and so on will have a resonance about collecting practices in the future. These are all constitutive parts of a process, and they will lead us to understand the importance of a personal archive, family archives, personal histories, the photographic album. All of these are, very real objects with very real dynamic histories. And I think the contemporary has the opportunity to embrace some of those histories. The contemporary also has the power to redirect them and make them completely obsolete. So what we do now with photography is we exert a certain amount of power of what we can do for the future. So when you ignore something, or when you try to say that it is not that essential, you might actually obliterate that process for time to come. So it becomes essential not to take bold, drastic moves always with the archive, but to take, I would also say take, registered steps, speak to people, do exhibitions, bring out books, have exchanges, and that will be our collective sense of a memory for the future. I have to talk in the abstract term because the future is so abstract, and I really think that has a bearing on what will eventually happen with the material that is produced now.
I believe Urs Stahl, in an interview after his talk in Delhi, did say that till such time India has a museum of photography, it really can't be seen as a country which engages in thinking about photography. What would you say to that?
Well, I mean, India is a living museum, you know, Urs style. I sort of take Urs's, point of view very, very seriously. I think that there should be a photography museum with time, and I think all the things happening right now are to the creation of a museum space, perhaps with the passage. I know that Tasveer is already trying to make one in South India, and there are many people involved with that process as well. But are we talking about a national museum for photography? Are we looking at how the national museums for the other arts or for our antique arts actually exist today? Are we actually looking at how difficult or what will be, the political resonance of what is collected within an archive for a museum, given the strange political times that we live in? Who will decide what goes into that archive? I think private investments and private sort of ways of going about it will create different spaces in different time. But we do have to think about the nationalistic when we come to this national space of photography, which I would step back from a little bit, engage with, with advisories and with committees before it's really committed to just as a space where material can be put in. I mean, we are dealing with a country that has an immense sense of its own bureaucracy, and I'm sometimes very suspect about what is shown and how it's shown within those institutions, having known that our own national institution has not had a director for 10 years. So what kind of exercise will the government exert, or the ministries of culture exert over us and the freedoms that come with it? Certainly private spaces now exist, and certainly something should be forged for the future of a photography museum. But that will come from, I think, exercises like this happening far more, in a far more comprehensive way. After all, the photography festivals in India have started so recently in Delhi, in Bombay, and I'm sure more will sort of, start emerging. But we are getting there, and I think coming from Switzerland, it's easy or difficult to understand or not understand the constitutive situations here. But, with all due respect to Urs Tahil, he has the right idea for us, and I think it will happen. It's essential.
If I may just ask one more thing. There seems to be also a dearth of writing about photography in India. And though this might be a strange thing to say that it's a visual medium and why should it be written about, but I think that's what then creates conversations and dialogues about the practice. Any ideas of how that can be encouraged? Because I think that probably needs to be done.
Well, I think it's well on its way. I mean, most of the time when we are reaching out, for PICS or other modules, or even for the archive, with the archive, we are always looking at projects that take 5 to 7 years to materialize. Any one of these projects, this exhibition itself took 2.5 years, starting from the fundraising point to getting the scholarship done, to actually reading, to traveling, to do the scholarship, etc., etc. With the contemporary, I think it's also going to be essential to realize that it's not always essential to have an academic, even though I would am someone who really believes in the pedagogy of all of this. I think the exchanges one can have between literature or poetry and photography, these are things that need to be engaged in a far more, easy, in a manner that is not restraining a certain understanding. So the idea of juxtaposing photography with poetry, or, just a biographical sense of the image is something we've started with PICS. And I must say one of my ulterior motives has always been to expose then people to the archive and show books and to, get them to read up about it. I think one of the things that we have tried to do is, we did this a year and a half ago, is that we as a foundation have given Delhi University a proposal to start a curriculum on the history of photography. And it has been accepted by the history department at DU. Now we are in the process of trying to understand how to practically go ahead and to find teachers for it, because the teachers also have had to have an exposure to an archive. So It's, all of these little cycles that are beginning to turn now. And we have scholars who come to the archive who have gone to do their PhDs. I have great hopes for them to come back and to become professors in time, if that's one way. So I think a little bit of, patience with this is required, and it's on its way.
So the seeding's being done, and we can wait for the fruit. Thank you so much, Rahaab.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And it is the photograph of a victim, it is the photograph of a victor, of a face that may have struck the viewer as a complex overlaying of chemicals upon metal. This is the portrait of Henry Havelock, who died in the Tira expedition by a Khaibari tribesman in the 1850s. And at times, death in an image was also trying to arrest the moment of the exiting of life. And this became quite an important, I would say, trope within European photography, where the dead person was uplifted and his eyes were prized open so that he could look directly into the camera, and you could notice that flicker of life that had just suddenly left him. It takes on a kind of macabre stance. And I particularly enjoy showing you this image of two severed heads in a kind of embrace, or let us say in a kiss. I often think of this as my relationship to the archive very often, contending with all this historic material, but also falling in love with it and disliking it from time to time. This is, of course, by a French neurologist called Duchenne, and he wrote a book called The Mechanism of Facial Expressions by attaching electrodes to faces, and therefore coming up with the notion of how actually facial expressions are made. So if you're on your email and you have these Well, very quickly now begin. I'd like to thank Dinesh and of course the entire team of the Delhi Photo Festival for the invitation to speak here, and of course for organizing the festival over the last several years, the second issue of which we are attending. It was a very generous introduction to say that I know a lot about photography in India, but it's really an area that I think of as a micro history associated with, a history that we have going back 160, 170 years. It's also, I must say, a history that is largely untouched in terms of research, in terms of scholarship, a kind of pedagogical watershed, I would say, is what we have. So it's very difficult coming from the background that I do, which is really art historical, to understand modernity or post-modernity without actually understanding the tradition of Indian photography, or rather, let us say, photography in India. What I'm trying to look at today is South Asia, but this is not a kind of iteration of the best photographers or the most well-known photographers or the leading photographers. Rather, it is an exercise in understanding, or is it the South Asian region per se, photographs of people in South Asia, or the history of photography in the region as a whole. All of these positions designated convergences when we thought of doing this exhibition, and we're doing it as in I am doing it with a co-curator, Beth Citron, in New York, as I mentioned, opening at the Rubin Museum. Does the archive hold any way of approaching or deviating from a collective identity in South Asia? But the archive certainly presents these areas as ones of constant revision, redrafted with time, certainly redrafted with geography. What India was in the 19th century is certainly not what India is today. So how do we actually understand South Asian photography within the context of an archive? It's very different. My stance then looks at material primarily from a collection, which is the Al-Qazi collection, not all collections as such, and hence this is a work in progress awaiting a larger surfeit of material that will emerge from the archive, and I'm talking about the archive that will exist in and outside India. This is also about the portrait, the body, perhaps even the figure, figuration as the abstract form of the real body. And so if I begin here with a daguerreotype was the first photographic process that was patented. Emoticons, it is really inspired by the work that he did 170 years ago. Looking at the daguerreotype, I decided to take a quote of an artist from the 19th century. And he said, "We didn't trust ourselves at first to look long at human beings and believed that the little tiny faces in the picture could see us. So powerfully was everyone affected by the unaccustomed clarity and the unaccustomed truth." The German artist Karl Blossfeld was disturbed upon seeing his own species imprinted on a shimmering sheet in an unconventional manner. Unconventional because the subject had perished and had left an imprint. The power of a portrait lies in the uneasy acceptance that while you reflect upon this subject, somehow those eyes, the tiny impressions of light upon paper, they look back at you. So photography has repeatedly genuflected to the portrait, a means of staging the self, and at times this is done with the defiant pose, images here from Sri Lanka by a company called Skeen, or at times with the distant gaze, with Burmese images that are flowing through in the 19th century, all with photographers who are tying India or South Asia into a kind of visual thesaurus. But when we think of the portrait, we think of the innate connection with the integrity of the body, rather our in what South Asia means within the context of an archive. So I work as a curator to an archive that has over 90,000 images, and all of these images are kind of ebbing and flowing within the context of the geography of what we consider South Asia to be today. It's certainly about itinerant photographers traveling from time to time and from place to place. So the point here is that I would be addressing the complexities of understanding geography and identity, and it's really based on a publication that is due to come out in the next 2 weeks of an exhibition that we are doing in New York at the Rubin Museum. It is a museum dedicated to Indian art, well, South Asian art or Asian art, but with a big focus on India. And the title of that exhibition is Allegory and Illusion, something that I will try to explain within the course or in the course of this lecture. So I begin here. With photography, we privilege a medium to which there are many variables, assertions, and alliances. Some of the complications that will occur here emerge when I highlight what I consider to be photography in South Asia or photography from South Asia. Should we privilege the photographer or the medium? Is it South Asian photographers that concern us,